and thank you, Ken, for the nice introduction. Tonight we want to talk to you about the link between transportation and land use. And before we delve deeper into the presentation, it's probably okay to define a few terms that Jeff and I will both be referring to frequently. And when we talk about transportation, we really mean the entirety of all transportation modes. That includes the automobile, bicycles, pedestrians, transit, trucks, and the associated infrastructure with those modes. And when we talk about land use, then it is mostly in a larger context of place and what's frequently called context, which is really the full spectrum of land use and built form, including the streets, taken together, that form our urban environments. And so as we talk about context, what are some of the major elements that make up the context? So there is, as I mentioned, land use, which is a major factor in the design of streets, as we will see. And the intensity of land use is associated with travel demands that need to be met by adjacent roadways or the roadway system in its entirety. It also, the types of land uses, whether they be residential or retail, determine the activity levels on sidewalks and the street as a whole. And with that, it is a co-determinant of how wide a road is, how wide a pedestrian environment needs to be in order to accommodate those that want to travel on a given stretch of road. And it also relates to whether or not there may be a need for on-street parking. So all of these things flow from land uses that are accommodated adjacent to a street. And then we have site design. Site design refers to the arrangement of buildings on the lot. How far are they away from the property line that abuts the street? How are they oriented toward the street? And then also, how are the vehicles that may travel to a given destination and site, how are they accommodated on that lot? Are they out in front toward the street? We hope not. Or are they located behind the building? So those are all issues that are addressed by site design. And then finally, building design gets at the height and massing of individual buildings. And buildings as they front the street determine the level of enclosure that you might experience as you're traveling on the street, whether as in an automobile, as a bicyclist or pedestrian. So, as Ken just said, in the last 10, 15 years, we've made great strides in how we're approaching the connection between land use and transportation. But that hasn't always been the case. It wasn't just looked at as a whole, it was looked at as individual pieces. And so land use and transportation were dealt with by people that have completely different educational backgrounds. One group are transportation planners, the others are, like Ken, were land use planners. And the instruments that these planners worked with, they singled out particular aspects. So the regional transportation plan, for instance, would simplify land use. And in this diagram below, you see the red lines represent the streets, and the gray is just sort of like an input to a transportation planner with these little red stubs coming out. That's where the cars are counted that in this sort of almost fantasy world are entering the transportation facility at that point. And but there's no consideration, or was no consideration, of what that development, this gray mass, might look like and what its relationship otherwise is to the street. And the land use planners, they knew there were streets, but they would be looking more at, well, how to distribute land uses whether the residential is over here and retail is over there, and then some parks and civic buildings, and that would be the focus of their planning. And so everybody looked at it just from their perspective, and transit planners would look at just potential ridership that flows from given land uses, and there's very little regard for how the street is designed. So the conventional planning practice up until recently just simplified this relationship and individualized it. So as a result, we ended up with streets that looked like the example at the top rather than what you see at the bottom. So that's why why everybody who recognized that there is an issue looked at, well, how can we look at transportation planning and land use in an integrated fashion? And this is depicted here at the very right, whereas here, this is the conventional scope of a roadway plan. So the roadway planner just looks at the roadway, ignores the land use. The land use planner is just concerned with the land uses, but not with the design of the street. And what we're looking for is a planning approach that looks at both of these major components as a whole that is very intricately linked together, and actually looks at both of these components on an equal footing, which is really key. So what we're looking for then is an integrated planning practice that creates walkable environments that include a mix of density and land uses, so that there isn't a segregation of land uses which always makes distances travel to whatever your needs are longer. Whereas if you have a mixed environment, you might decide to walk because it's not that far away to go to a neighborhood retail store, for instance. Orienting the entries to the street is important to create activities on sidewalks, and streets, the site, and buildings are designed to be at a pedestrian scale and not some overwhelming car-oriented scale. At the last presentation that Jeff and I gave, we talked about transportation networks and how important it is that that network be fine-grained, and the integration of complete streets that balance the needs of all modes is also a component of this. So for those of you who were here when we presented last, I used Santana Row as an example of that meets actually a lot of these components that I just mentioned. Mix of uses, human scale, applied to the streetscape as well as to the buildings, and it is a place that people actually like to be at, and developers have recognized that there is a desire to be in these kinds of places as a pedestrian. But we also discovered that this is just an artificially created environment that lives like an island in a sea of very auto-oriented uses and segregated land uses, as this, for those of you who like to look at aerials, it is fairly easy to pick up how segregated those land uses are here. And so this is based on that type of environment, is based on the fact that we have accepted the automobile for decades as the only way of moving about, and this has led to a pattern of dispersed land uses where it's assumed you will go there by car. And we've all learned to fall into this pattern. That kind of land use pattern discourages walking, transit, and bike use. So how did this happen? And I used this slide last time because it illustrates on the left side is the Rockridge neighborhood in Oakland. On the right-hand side, the Danville Bishop Ranch area, and again, you can see how relatively human scale the environment is on the left-hand side and fine-grained, and how large scale is on the right-hand side. And the Danville environment is just again solely based on the acceptance of cars being the only means of transportation for getting around in this environment. And so these two patterns on the left, the typical pattern is a mixed-use neighborhood, mixed-use districts, and that are based on old stops of streetcars in many cases, and where multiple modes of transportation serve this environment. On the right-hand side, we're talking about residential subdivisions, shopping centers that are all too far apart from one another so that you could actually walk to these places. So there's only one mode of transportation, that is the car. So what we're looking for then is an integrated planning practice that affords a parallel approach between transportation and land use planning processes. And so this means that the area transportation plan and comprehensive plan, this is really sort of at the regional and city level. You know, you need to sync things up, because if you don't look at this higher level, it can already go wrong and you get out of step. So that's why it is important to start at that level of planning. And then obviously, when a community vision is established for transportation, you should also have a shared vision for the land use future that you're looking for your community. And step number 3 is actually really important, and that is you develop a set of street types and context zones for your community. What this means is that you're looking at and we're actually just in the process of doing this for the plan that we're working on with Ken, that we're looking at the streets in San Mateo, and when you and we're looking at these contexts, the places in San Mateo, and we're developing a range of street types that serve these different contexts. And so that is a very important step to go through. And then step number 4, initial street concept and testing. This can be done in corridor and district planning and zoning format on the land use side. And then also very important is that you end up with very clear guidance on the details of how to design a good street, and you have learned about this in other taste and talk presentations and at the workshops that many of you have visited. And this is parallel on the site planning and building design side as well. So just a quick example of an area, this is in the Charlottesville, Albemarle area, in Albemarle County area in Virginia, where we looked at an area that has a very poor network, as you can see here, with the US 29 going right down the middle, and in fact the highway is serving as, in many cases, the sole access to fairly large-scale land uses that are lined up along the street, mostly shopping centers and employment centers. So, the main street was overburdened by having to accommodate regional commute, local shopping, and all this traffic. And as a result, it has 6 or 8 lanes in some places. And so the question is, how do you get away from that? And so then we looked at the possibility of creating a supplemental network of smaller streets that take some of that local traffic that's on the highway off into the adjacent areas, and actually allows for a different form of land use to become a possibility, at least. And then in a third step down the future, of course, and all of this needs to be made possible by development opportunities that need to be real, otherwise nobody is doing anything. But there is at least the possibility of then densifying this network further and to begin to actually have very different development types face these different types of streets. So there's a diversification in the network and in the street types that is followed then by developers realizing that that type of street needs to be faced by a different type of development. And so it's sort of this give and take between transportation network, street design, and land use planning and development. This is one of the main arterials that feeds US 29, and you see the typical kind of development that you would expect there, with vehicle priority being the only purpose for this street. And then with this initial network improvement that I showed in the second of the slides that showed the street network, you can begin to bring in something like bicycle lanes, have some development come out to the street, serve pedestrians, and reduce the significance of vehicle superiority, but it's still vehicle supportive but tolerant of pedestrians and bicycles. Whereas then if you go, if this network that is denser became a reality, then you are really looking at new opportunities for different kind of development to come in that is actually pedestrian supportive and just vehicle tolerant, and obviously no longer serves as a major access to the highway, because that's taken on by other parts of the network. So just a real quick, another example of a potential transformation of a street in an employment center, which of course for the peninsula, that's something that is a frequent example, where the widening of the sidewalk can be an advanced improvement that a community or developer could put into place, and that could be followed by initial development that now faces the street and takes advantage of the widened sidewalk and calmed road. There may even be some transit coming in, depending on how large of an employment center we're talking about, and then that can be followed by additional development that even more intensifies the relationship of the built environment to the street. And with that, I'm handing it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Thomas. So once again, my name is Jeff Tumlin, and I'm a transportation planner with Nelson Nygaard. We're based in San Francisco. And while Thomas is the sort of suave European urban designer that shows pretty pictures, I'm the nerdy transportation guy that is going to show lots of charts of data. So in that spirit, I want to do a little data collection exercise to start thinking about the relationship between transportation and land use. To get here this evening, how many of you walked? Raise your hand. All right, good number. How many of you rode a bicycle? Also a substantial number. How many of you drove a car with 2 or more people in it? Okay, good, good. How many of you, we're not going to shame you, there's no moralizing in transportation, it's just about the data. How many of you drove alone? Okay. And how many of you did something other than what I mentioned? Like rollerblade, kayak, or something? Yes. Tell us what you did. Caltrain. All right, Caltrain, excellent. Yeah, that's right, I didn't even mention transit. How many of you took a Samtrans or other form of public transit? Okay, another one back there. All right. And among all of you, how many of you did or are intending to do something else here in downtown San Mateo before or after this lecture? Aha, also very important data. So, all of this goes to demonstrate that there is a profound relationship between transportation and land use, even for activities such as coming to this event tonight. If this event were held out in the public auditorium out at Oracle or out at the Coyote Point Museum, no matter how lovely it is, we would have seen a very different sort of travel behavior, both in terms of how people got to this event, but whether they also chained it with doing other things both before and after. While it is very rare for a place to generate 100% car trips or 100% walk or transit trips, all places have some variation. And there are a lot of variables that go into how we make decisions about how we get from A to B and whether we make that trip at all. And fortunately, there's been a lot of research into the factors that make us choose the modes of transportation that we do. Many of those factors have a rather small influence on our travel behavior. But in the world of congestion and traffic planning, small changes make a very, very big difference indeed. The difference between free-flowing traffic and total gridlock is only 10% more vehicles. It's a very small difference. And you've all experienced this on a freeway. Like the density of cars increases and you're all going there, you're still going 50 miles an hour, everything's fine. And then suddenly there's a wave of traffic grinding to a halt. That is a few percentage points difference in the number of cars out there on the freeway. The same is true in urban streets, and so we care about relatively subtle differences. The 5 key factors that researchers from all over the world, but for dozens and dozens of studies here in the United States have come down to that are the ones that mattered, they gave them all Ds. They're called the 5 Ds. They're the land use factors. They include density, diversity or the mix of uses, distance to transit, destination accessibility, which is a little bit of a complicated one, but it's how close are you to things by different modes, and then design, which is really about a lot of the stuff that Thomas just talked about. And I'm going to get into these in a little bit more detail. Now, it's important to understand that land use obviously isn't everything. There are some choices that we make that are largely based upon social demographics or socioeconomics. If you're 12 years old, you're probably not driving alone. You may be generating a lot of carpool trips, but you're not generating a lot of drive-alone trips. Similarly, if you're very low income, if you can't afford a car, or if you're too disabled to drive a car, or if your social preferences say, it's boring to drive a car, it's a waste of my time because it takes me away from my cell phone, that has a big influence on travel behavior. So there are some factors that are really socioeconomic driven, others that are more land use driven, but within every socioeconomic category, land use then becomes a significant factor once you control for that variable. The factor that we start with oftentimes is in some ways the most complicated, the most misunderstood, but also the most important, and that is density. All else being equal, as density increases, vehicle miles traveled decreases. And it decreases on this very interesting curve. So this is density increasing and vehicle miles traveled decreasing along that curve. What's interesting about this curve is where the inflection point lies. You don't need a Manhattan level of density in order to get a significant difference in travel behavior, as our survey right here this evening just demonstrated. The level of density here in downtown San Mateo gets you almost all the way, all of the benefit that you would get with Manhattan just without the subways. So San Mateo doesn't quite have a great subway network yet. That would make a big difference, but you're at the right level of density, not only here in downtown, but in some of your mixed-use centers throughout the city of San Mateo, where it's possible to get a quart of milk for many people without being forced to get into a car. It's possible for some kids, not all kids, to be able to walk to school. And keeping in mind that 80% of our travel is non-work related. It's the needs of daily life that are really important to a lot of our travel decision making. And one of the things that's really interesting about density is that having just enough households within a walkable radius is the thing that retailers look for when they're making their locational decisions. Walkable retail requires enough people within walking distance in order to make the market work. The same factor is at play for public transportation. Public transportation needs a certain amount of potential market in order to be able to justify providing public transit at a frequency at which it becomes of interest to people who have a choice. So this is why you see, particularly here on the peninsula, lower density residential neighborhoods either getting absolutely no bus service or like hourly or school trippers at best, but actually reasonably good service in the downtowns and in the more mixed-use neighborhoods, and particularly around the Caltrain stations. So density is this interesting variable, but it is not an independent variable. If you put density in the wrong place, it doesn't create much benefit. You put density out in a place where there's no transit and nothing to walk to, doesn't work very well, just generates a lot of concentration of auto trips. Similarly, if you put density in a way that is ugly, also doesn't work very well because people don't really like it and it can be very miserable. The other thing that we notice about density is that, again, as density increases, people's likelihood of walking and biking also increases significantly. And again, we don't need a Manhattan level of density. This sort of density threshold of 12, 9, 13 units per acre, this is pretty dense stuff, but this is kind of all we need for the magic of density to really kick in, provided it is in the right place, and very importantly, provided it is designed well. There's also something that's quite often misunderstood about density, and that is the relationship between height and density. If you look over at the Oracle campus, there's a lot of high buildings there. The Oracle campus is very, very low density. It's all surface parked. The assumption is that pretty much everyone there is driving. When you look at the Oracle campus as a whole, the density there is a small fraction of the density here in downtown San Mateo, even in some of the more low-rise residential neighborhoods immediately proximate to downtown, but that are still, that still feel leafy and green and walkable. So density is not about the size of the building or the height. It's simply about the number of employees or the number of households that are, how compact they are together. And again, that difference between the quarter-acre lot versus 12 units to the acre, huge difference in terms of travel behavior. And again, it's critically important to always look at good design as we're talking about density, both in terms of the design of the building so that it looks and feels right, but also that there's the appropriate amount of open space, and that indeed some of the densest neighborhoods in the region, people may not have very big yards, but those best dense neighborhoods have fantastic public open spaces, just like Central Park here in downtown San Mateo. Other key factor is this factor of the distance to transit. If transit is inconvenient, if it's too far to get to, people tend not to use it. If people are within an easy walk of transit, the likelihood of them using it increases significantly. There's nothing particularly magic about the half-mile radius that we oftentimes look at as transportation planners in terms of the ideal target for distance to transit, but it is a good rule of thumb. And so that is also the kind of place where we like to concentrate. If there's going to be a mix of density in a community, cluster your density closest to transit and also closest to the needs of daily life, to retail, to schools, to other things that generate a lot of travel. Putting density, transit, and retail together starts to create the sort of magic that we have here in downtown San Mateo. Thomas talked a lot about being smart about where you're putting density and connecting it to the surrounding community and thinking about public transportation, connecting the streets together, which is the other variable, which is design, which has a big impact on travel behavior as well. So here in downtown San Mateo and in all the residential neighborhoods around it, you've got fairly small blocks, super interconnected streets. So that if you are, here and you want to get there, it's a relatively straight line, whether you're walking or biking or driving. And this is also important. In a complete network, drive trips are a lot shorter than they are in an incomplete network where you don't have a lot of streets. So even for driving trips, you're still having a significant impact on vehicle miles traveled with a connected street network rather than a street network like this, where if I'm here and I want to get there, I've got to go all the way around. And I'm most likely not going to be making that trip on bike or on foot, unless there happens to be a little green path that connects it, but in this case there's not. And of course, this is also a place where we've effectively made public transportation illegal. There is no way that public transportation can have enough of a potential market to justify its existence really at any level of frequency. because you simply don't have enough people within walking distance of any bus stop. And that bus has to take long, circuitous journeys, far too expensive for the public transit agency to provide. The other key factor, one that I've already mentioned, and one that many of you have acknowledged that you are going to be enjoying this evening, is diversity, which is the mix of uses. Diversity is a super important variable for a lot of reasons. One reason is that it makes it possible to get to school or to get your quart of milk without getting in your car. But it also creates another magical phenomenon, which we call park once. So even for those of you who've driven here to downtown San Mateo, you may be parking your car once here at the library and then walking a block away to go to dinner at one of the fabulous restaurants down here. While that's still a drive trip, it's half of the driving trips and probably significantly less than half of the vehicle miles traveled than that same trip if this had been located in a strip mall and it wasn't possible or easy or delightful to walk to the restaurant that's just 2 blocks away. There are many environments, look up and down El Camino, where if you are on one side of the El Camino and you need to go to the restaurant on the other side of El Camino, it would be logical to actually get in your car in order to drive across the street. You wouldn't do that here in downtown. That is the impact of land use on transportation. This other key factor is about destination accessibility. This is a little bit more complicated of a variable, but basically it asks how much stuff is accessible to you within a certain amount of time or a certain distance. Here, again, in downtown San Mateo, the number of jobs that you have access to via Caltrain is extraordinary. One of the reasons why the quality of life and the cost of living is so high here in San Mateo is the accessibility that you've got both to jobs and to recreational amenities throughout this region. Other regions are not so lucky. But it also means, because of Caltrain and because of the other public transportation investments that are there, and because your bike network actually connects to something, that people use these facilities. So if transit doesn't actually go to where the jobs are, or if the bike paths don't actually go to where the schools and the recreational amenities and the jobs are, they're much less likely to be used. So taking all of this together, it is possible to create these complicated charts like this, which are elasticity curves for different variables. What this says basically for each of our D variables down here, various studies have come up with average elasticity rates that show for these independent variables what, say, 100% increase in intersection street density gets you in terms of vehicle miles traveled. So if you double the amount, the density of your street intersections, that is getting rid of cul-de-sacs and superblocks and instead creating grid of streets, if you double your street intersection density, you get a 12% decrease in vehicle miles traveled. That's huge. 12% decrease in vehicle miles traveled eliminates all congestion throughout the system just by changing one variable. Some of these variables you'll notice, like density, the elasticity of density as an independent variable is very low. If all you do is increase, if you double density, you only get a 4% decrease in vehicle miles traveled as an independent variable. But if doubling your density also gets you a mix of uses, because suddenly there's enough households in order to bring in the grocery store, if doubling the density also gets you a quadrupling of your transit frequency, then that in turn affects some of these other variables on the chart. So this all gets pretty complicated, but as travelers yourselves, it's pretty easy to understand how these factors work together. And when your traffic engineers are doing complicated analyses like this, to ask them smart questions. Many of our traffic analysis tools still don't include all of these factors. Oftentimes when I'm doing a traffic analysis, the city's own requirements force me to assume that a new residential infill project next to the main street is going to generate the exact same amount of the exact same amount of traffic as if that project were located out in the middle of nowhere where nothing was within walking distance and schools were far away. So fortunately here in San Mateo, your processes are a lot smarter, and this is the reason why, because there's real data to support more sophisticated analysis of travel behavior and to design better cities through using better tools. And again, other elasticity curves showing the relationship between the D variables and an increase in transit, so that we can use changes in land use to estimate changes in transit ridership in order to justify funding improvements for transit, even in advance of land use changes. Both BART and Caltrain and Samtrans are starting to use these tools in part to implement some of the regional planning that has gone on at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association of Area Governments. There are a lot of communities like San Mateo that have implemented all of these D variables in smart ways. One of the most interesting ones in the United States is Arlington, Virginia, which has grown by many millions of square feet since the 1970s, while keeping its local and arterial traffic totally constant since the 1970s. I'm not going to say that there's no freeway congestion in Arlington, just like I will not say that there's no freeway congestion here in the Bay Area, but it is possible to continue to grow your economy while actually improving your local quality of life and improving accessibility of all modes of transportation, including local driving. Another city that has done an extraordinary job of this exact same thing is Vancouver, British Columbia, where they have had almost a 20% increase in population, 16% increase in jobs, and in total actual numbers, a 5% drop in vehicles entering the city, and an even more extraordinary drop in their downtown. They have nearly doubled their population while decreasing total vehicles entering downtown Vancouver by 20% in actual numbers. This is an amazing reduction. And they've done it largely not through massive investment in transit, but by super, super strong emphasis on the quality of the walk experience, by investing in beautiful sidewalks, beautiful parks, by forcing developers to design attractive buildings that really focus on the ground floor, that focus on landscape, and by investing in bike connectivity throughout their whole city. That has really been what has made the difference in Vancouver and has allowed them to have this significant increase in their economy, a significant increase in quality of life, and in citizen happiness, all at the same time while reducing motor vehicle trips and achieving their CO2 reduction goals. That unlike its peer cities throughout Canada, where travel time has been increasing over the last decade, people's commutes in Vancouver are actually shorter, largely because they're choosing to live in more walkable neighborhoods closer to jobs and to services. So it's possible to have a win-win-win situation, but only if we pay close attention to all 5 of these factors and plan for them in concert with each other. And with that, I think both Thomas and I would be happy to take any questions you may have.